Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Science of Reading program webinar series, Reading Comprehension in Action. My name is Laura Almazara, and I'm on the literacy team here at Amplify. We're so excited you've joined us today to learn more about Amplify ELA, our middle school core literacy curriculum. Today's session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording link and presentation deck via email later this week. And you'll also receive a certificate of attendance for joining us. If you'd like access to closed captioning, please click on the CC button in the bottom tray and then show captions. Be sure to register for our other webinars at amplify.com/fall 2025-SOR-demos. Even if you can't make it all of them, we'll send out recording links for all of the webinars you register for. And we still have our exciting educator panels left, including one on Thursday. We welcome comments in the chat. And to start, let's find out where everyone's joining us from. I am joining from sunny Phoenix. It's still sunny, starting to get cold. Jealous of the snow other people have been experiencing, but it's also nice to not have to shovel.
I'm joining from slushy and wet Massachusetts.
Yeah, we got some people who are experiencing winter joining us too. Western New York, we have Atlanta, New York City. It's great. We thank you for joining us today, especially on a Tuesday in December. So today's session is called Improving Middle School Reading Comprehension with Amplify ELA, and it's presented by our very own Deb Sabin. Deb Sabin is Amplify's Chief Academic Officer of Amplify ELA and has spent over 30 years in the education industry. She has focused on key areas of literacy development, critical thinking, and student engagement at the middle school level. Welcome, Deb.
Thank you, Laura. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to start by apologizing. I don't know if you can tell by my voice, but I'm battling some sort of flu cold thing. So please bear with me as I grab for various drinks and mainline cough drops. I'm sure that all of you have brought home various viruses from your Thanksgiving, and you will be able to be very patient with me. Um, I'm really excited to be here. I have been at Amplify for about 14 years, and before that, I spent a long time working as a secondary ELA and literacy teacher, administrator, trainer, curriculum developer. Um, and with my focus on secondary education, I'm going to be honest and say that I came late to the idea of science of reading, some of the best practices in terms of research around reading. Um, but I will also say that the known and confirmed science in this secondary space has also lagged behind what is known about early reading. What that means for all of us, it's a really exciting time to be involved in the secondary literacy space because the level of science and research is truly kind of bubbling up, and we can really learn from what people are discovering. So all the work that you're engaged with as secondary teachers and administrators thinking about best practices for readers in your classrooms is obviously meaningful, but it's also incredibly timely. I have three goals for us today. I'm hoping that you'll leave here better understanding what we mean by reading comprehension in terms of the secondary reader. I want to identify and discuss some of the critical measures and levers of strong reading comprehension. And I want to talk about the elements in Amplify ELA and perhaps in many other literacy programs in general that support and can be used to strengthen those levers to drive stronger reading comprehension. I will also say that I'm relying a little more on my notes today. That's due to various cold medications that I'm on. And as Laura said, please keep those questions coming in the Q&A because we will have time at the end to answer some of them. Okay, to understand how reading comprehension works, it is important to begin with a strong framework of how reading works. So the science of reading refers to known and growing research that deconstructs how children learn to read. Reading proficiency requires a complex combination of skills, and there are two main frameworks that help us break it all down: the simple view of reading and the reading rope. Let's start with the simple view of reading. This represents how the brain learns to process words on a page. This understanding of how the brain reads has been around a long time and has been validated many times through research. So what does this equation represent? It's saying that skilled reading is the product of two elements, language comprehension and word recognition. It's really important to think about the idea that it's a product, not a sum. So if you put a zero in either of that yellow or blue boxes, you do not end up with a skilled reader of any kind. Um, and if I think of word recognition, I think of like the ability to code. And I can say for myself, you could give me a page of Italian, I could read it, I could decode those words because all the letters and sound patterns are very similar to what I know, but I have no language comprehension skills in Italian, so I would not be able to read and derive any meaning from that page. Similarly, there are many of us that can understand and comprehend music. We can listen to the notes changing. We can tell when they're going up and down, longer, shorter, what the rhythm of the piece is. But unless we know how to decode musical notes on a score, we can't read. We are not a skilled reader of music. Let's talk about these two things independently. Language comprehension is the ability to understand and make sense of the spoken language. So it's natural. Humans are born with areas of the brain that are dedicated to oral language development. And you know this because at birth, you see babies taking in all the language that they hear. That's receptive language. And after not so many months, they start to express the language that is modeled for them. We develop our vocabulary and our grammar through this receptive capacity for oral language. And our students come to school with oral language comprehension. Some have much more background knowledge, some have much more vocabulary, some have more language and more experience in the oral environment. And those distinctions will have an impact, but they do come with the natural ability to process language and the capacity to do so. And that's critical because the starting place for reading is actually speech, our ability to hear words, to hear the sounds. And then that other part of skilled reading is word recognition. That's reading words on a page, literally the ability to see the letter shapes and translate that code into a sound, decoding. This eventually happens with automaticity, but word recognition is not something that happens naturally. Reading instruction has to build the bridge between our oral language capacity and that we are kind of wired to process and the code on the page. So word recognition can be taught through roughly 2 years of explicit instruction. Yes, it involves rewiring and remapping certain structures of the brain, moving from recognized sounds, phonemes, to letter patterns, phonics. But we can say 2 years because there's a finite set of skills involved in decoding, in word recognition. And once the reader has that finite set of skills, they can apply it infinitely and with increasing automaticity. It does not mean that they're going to not slow down as they get older and come across more complex words, multisyllabic words. But again, it's a finite set of skills they need to decode and break that word down into its phonemes. And again, this is the first framework of the science of reading and the idea that it's the product of word recognition and language comprehension. The second framework that it's important for us to understand before we get to reading comprehension is the reading rope. Dr. Hollis Scarborough is an American psychologist and literacy expert focused on reading acquisition, specifically working on dyslexia. And she developed this analogy of Scarborough's rope to help us think of skilled reading as resembling the strands of a rope, illustrating how they're all interconnected and interdependent. And you can see here the distinct elements that make up those two components of language comprehension and word recognition. So word recognition, down to look at those blue strands at the bottom, is kind of the sounds that we hear and we make represented by letters, and these letters in combination make up words. And then moving to the top half of the rope, you can see those language comprehension areas. Broadly, language comprehension is our knowledge of the world and our knowledge of words or vocabulary that allows us to draw meaning across and from sentences to make a reasonable inference, to use our reasoning to create a mental model of the situation being described or the text we're reading. Early reading attends to these things kind of explicitly and distinctly. Kids are going to be spending time on word recognition skills and spending time talking a lot about what they are reading or discovering. And that's important because most of their cognitive energy when they are reading something is focused on word recognition, the language comprehension that they need to make a mental model of the text is for the early readers based on daily spoken vocabulary and experience. So when they're reading those decodables, it might be about a new pet and the knowledge they need, the vocabulary they need, the sentence structure they are encountering is largely based on things that they hear around them, whereas most of their cognitive energy is going into word recognition. There's a shift that's going to happen about third or fourth grade when those two large strands, as you can see, come together and are increasingly interconnected. And if early reading instruction has been successful, kids are becoming very automatic in their word recognition. That's when we start to talk about fluent readers. They need that automaticity with word recognition in order to put that cognitive energy no longer into decoding words, but into developing, expanding, and applying their knowledge to really be able to comprehend a text with proficiency. Because this is what's happening with the secondary readers. Let's look at those language comprehension strands a little more closely over on the right. So that knowledge that they need to kind of parse meaning from the text is, yes, it's based on the world around them, but also increasingly it's based on text that they're reading, the knowledge that they're drawing from text. Their vocabulary, yes, there's everyday conversational vocabulary, but also for the secondary readers, more and more, in order to understand text, they're reliant on an understanding of academic words, and more importantly, their knowledge of how words work. So morphology, the different endings that a word might have that indicate the past tense or the present tense, the connotation of a word, the word families that a one word might be connected to. Again, similarly for sentences, yes, the sentences that they understand in everyday speech are useful, but in addition to spoken grammar, if they're reading text at the middle school level, their reading proficiency is going to lean heavily on knowledge of text structures. Um, and reasoning, they're going to be increasingly not only just drawing on the knowledge that they have from every day, but drawing on the knowledge they have from that specific text or from other texts in order to make meaning. And all of that's coming together to create a meaningful representation of the text. So if we step back and look at those strands and that section on the right, two things really stand out. Reading proficiency for a secondary reader becomes increasingly reliant on a reader's growing knowledge. If you look at all those blue highlighted knowledge, idea of knowledge, and their ability to develop and use that knowledge to make meaning. That brings us to our working definition of reading comprehension. So let's think of reading comprehension as the process of deriving meaning, literal and inferred, from printed language. The reader is actively constructing a mental model of what is read that is consistent with their knowledge of the world. And you can see those two critical components of those strands of language comprehension, knowledge and meaning, really featured very prominently in the idea of reading comprehension. It's also important to note that this definition of reading comprehension notes that reading comprehension is an active process. So that first bullet talks about it's a process of deriving meaning, and that second bullet talks about the reader is actively constructing. A process and not a product means that it happens while students are reading. It's not something that happens after the last page. So I don't like close a book, done with all my word recognition, and think, okay, let me now work out the meaning of War and Peace. I have to be actively engaged in reading comprehension with every word, with every paragraph, and every page that I'm reading. A process, not a product, also have implications for our teaching. So students are actively engaged with the knowledge and meaning demands of each individual text. Yes, they're learning certain skills, really important skills and standards, and we can teach those skills, but we also need to be keenly aware of the specific needs and demands of that individual text. So what elements are students using to derive their meaning? What is the mental model they're constructing, and how can we strengthen this modeling, the modeling of this specific text? And if reading comprehension is largely the interplay between their knowledge and the language of the text, what are the levers we can use to measure or strengthen their reading comprehension? It turns out that certain factors are strongly associated with strong comprehension. And we're going to look at four critical components. Probably not surprising to see this on the first slide, fluency. Fluency has a huge impact on reading comprehension. Fluency is the ability to read the word in the text accurately, effortlessly, and with appropriate expression and phrasing. The correlation between a student's fluency and their comprehension is usually above zero point 0.5. So that's really high. It's not a one-to-one relation to reading comprehension, but if I understand how fluent a reader you are, I'm understanding a little more than half of your reading comprehension ability. That makes sense when we think about what fluency is measuring. First, it's really measuring the accuracy of word recognition. So the more words a student cannot read accurately, the higher the cognitive load used to figure out those words, and the reduced cognitive load they can put into deriving meaning. So if you look at that example on the right, if I'm stumbling over each of those longer words and I can't really, any of those light gray sections, I'm not really getting, I'm missing a lot of my ability to draw knowledge from the text across those sentences and come up with a complete mental model that I need for comprehension. Um, However, equally importantly, practicing fluency can increase the accuracy of word recognition. And just increasing the accuracy, just practicing their ability to say those words can result in increased reading comprehension. Again, because they're not stopping and stumbling over each of those words. But the other aspect of fluency is probably more for the secondary reader, more important when we think about reading comprehension, and that is prosody. When a student attends to the expression and phrasing of their reading, they're very likely to be paying attention to the meaning of what they are reading. So if we look at the example on the right, my decision about how to read this sentence, I never said she stole my money, and where to place my emphasis is also a decision about what I have decided is the meaning of this sentence. I never said she stole my money. I actually thought this other person did it. I never said she stole my money. I think she just borrowed it. I never said she stole my money. It was my credit cards that are missing. So depending on how I'm reading that sentence, I'm really reading that sentence with a sense of the mental representation or model I have of that sentence, how I'm comprehending it. And practicing prosody during fluency practice supports students to pay stronger attention to the meaning of the sentences they're reading and really can increase their comprehension. Okay, first one, but I said that fluency and comprehension are not a one-to-one relationship. One reason for this is that a reader's background knowledge plays such a large role in their comprehension. For early readers, much of the knowledge critical to understanding a text, as I said before, is coming from the world around them and from everyday experiences. So they're reading decodable books about a pets or families or a trip, and that spoken vocabulary is largely the same vocabulary that they're seeing in the text they are reading. But with each grade, the text they are drawing on rely more and more academic knowledge, the words, the syntaxes, and the world events and ideas found in books. I like to use this probably unrealistically complex sentence from the Gettysburg Address as an example. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So my ability to create the appropriate representation to comprehend this sentence is reliant on a certain level of academic knowledge. I have to have some sense that our fathers refers to the founders of America. In terms of the words, I need to understand that a proposition refers to some sort of a proposal or a plan or an idea that was brought forth. And I probably need to be able to understand the syntax enough to connect dedicated and understand that it refers to a new nation and not to the fathers, for example. So again, background knowledge starts to play an increasingly important role for secondary readers, not because they need it more, but because the breadth and the depth of the knowledge that they need is greater given the text that they're trying to read. Another critical factor in reading comprehension is inference, and causal inference is probably the most critical type. So causal inferences are inferences that specifically build the causal coherence of the reader's mental representation of the text necessary for comprehension. So as I'm reading, what am I inferring to create an accurate understanding of what's happening in the text? Let's look at this really short story on the right. The kids had planned a picnic in the park. Dad glanced out the window. He told them to find something else to do. A strong and reasonable causal inference from that story is that the weather is bad, so the picnic can't happen. As a reader, I'm elaborating on what exactly is in the text, but it's a reasonable inference that connects my knowledge of the world to what's happening in the text. A non-causal inference is that the kids want to go to the park to play soccer. Maybe that's true, but I'm not really elaborating on what is in the text. I'm kind of adding knowledge that's not in the text. And in this case, my inference is not really reasonable given what actually is in the text. To make meaning from what's in the text, readers are continually making inferences based on their knowledge of the world, based on their knowledge of words, based on their knowledge of the text. Probably that's where we got to that sense of like text to self, text to world type situation. It's what we need to be making these inferences using our knowledge to understand the text. Strong comprehenders are very good at making reasonable causal inferences and building a coherent mental model of the text. They don't read word to word, they're constantly making connections, and those connections are reasonable. And readers are often checking their reasonableness as they keep reading. So if I was reading this story on the right and the next sentence said he told him to find something else to do, the kids looked out the window and saw fire trucks and smoke, I might go back and say, oh, it wasn't bad weather that is keeping them from the picnic. It's something else happening in the park. Again, with each sentence I read, I'm not only creating a new mental representation, but I'm kind of checking what I thought in the past. I want to pause for a moment here to talk about teaching comprehension skills and strategies. Things like inferencing, main idea, or predicting. Teaching these types of skills does actually show a bump in students' comprehension. So these are skills that we can teach, but research also shows that this initial bump dissipates over time. So continually refreshing these skills, continually reviewing what is an inference, does not continue to produce stronger comprehension. And why is that? Well, we kind of looked at that sentence from the Gettysburg and talked about the fact that each text requires a specific set of knowledge, particular words, particular familiarity with structure or background, and it's developing those knowledge strands that will have a much larger impact on comprehension of a particular text than continually practicing inferencing outside of the text. So, yes, these skills are important for kids to understand and practice, but their impact on comprehension dissipates over time. And that makes sense when we think about inferencing with a more complex text. Let's look at this example from Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart, which is an Amplify's grade 7 unit, Poe and Poetry. So this is the climactic scene where our narrator has invited the policeman into his home after he's killed his landlord and buried the body under the floorboards. Now he begins to hear a sound as he chats with the policeman. Let's consider what connections a reader needs to make to arrive at the needed inference down at the bottom that only the narrator hears this song. No doubt I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the noise increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much as the sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles, in a key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose all over and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard it not? Almighty God, no. No, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear these hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark! Louder, louder, louder. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. Take up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. All right. In addition to getting very excited about the suspense of this story, students have to read with enough fluency to follow the sequence of the narrator's thought through some difficult syntaxes and some difficult vocabulary. They can't get tripped up by vocab words like vehemently, mockery, gesticulation. They have to recognize that the narrator is hearing that sound over and over, louder and louder. This is likely the most obvious inference. So I marked all the places, well, not even all the places, where he talks about this noise, this noise, this noise. Then they need to pick up on really only two small clues, two descriptions of the policeman's actions, and make the reasonable and coherent inference that the fact that the policemen do not react to this noise means the noise is only heard by the narrator. In other words, there are a lot of factors that could interfere with making that reasonable inference beyond whether or not I know what an inference is. On the other hand, being able to continually make these inferences and supporting students to continually make these inferences is critical to comprehension. I will say that one lever that can both help strengthen and provide a strong measure of students' ability to make these coherent mental models of the text is writing. Writing about a text involves actively developing and encoding our understanding of that text. So when students are asked to write about the text, they're being asked to actively process the information in the text to represent that work of inference or that work of elaboration or to create that mental model as they are writing. They're also encoding their understanding of the text. So they're taking information about the text from their working or short-term memory and converting into a format that could be stored long-term memory. So writing is an excellent way to encode more information from reading into long-term storage. And that by pushing that knowledge into long-term memory, it supports stronger comprehension as they can keep working with that text because now they have access to more information about that text. In fact, the Carnegie Foundation conducted analysis of research studies to really look at the effect of different writing practices on students' reading performance and found that writing about text, teaching writing, and writing more regularly all had a positive impact on students' reading proficiency and comprehension. So it's really important to integrate writing into reading, not only to improve their writing, but really as a measure and lever of comprehension. It also, as teachers, provides us with a critical window into their comprehension. Let's look at this example. Here's a student writing prompt embedded in the grade 8 Amplify ELA lesson in the Frankenstein Science and Science Fiction unit from grade 8, where students have been reading an early section of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I don't know if anyone has had the opportunity to see the latest film version of Frankenstein, but I have a lot of thoughts about it. After the death of his mother, Victor Frankenstein becomes obsessed with determining the elixir of life, and his studies kind of take him to extremes. So after reading about his intense grief and his obsessive studies, students are asked to write for 10 minutes to this prompt. Is Victor more focused on life or death or on both as he investigates and makes his creation? Explain your answer using specific details from the text. Let's read what this writer wrote. I think that Victor is more interested in life than death. The text states, I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. This evidence shows that he was looking for a way to cure human life if they have a sickness. He wanted to find a cure for people when they get sick and are most likely to die so they can live. According to the text, it states, if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death. This evidence shows that he wanted to take away a disease from people that are really sick and could die. He wanted people to have life. He felt like if he could take away a sickness that can kill someone, he would feel like he has done the impossible, and he will feel proud of himself. So let's think about what this writer is doing. They are selecting particular sentences, so particular text evidence highlighted in yellow. That's a strong sign of comprehension because they're choosing certain sentences as more important to reading, to meaning than other sentences. And let's look what they're doing with that evidence. They're unpacking a complex syntax and paraphrasing the ideas that it contains. So the search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, they're now kind of putting that in their own words. What was the meaning that they took away from that? Looking for a way to cure human life if they have a sickness. Then they are parsing vocabulary. So again, taking a little phrase, banish disease, and putting those complex vocabulary words in a framework of similar words. So in other words, what is the meaning that I'm taking away? And when you see this writing, when you read it as a teacher, you can really see the student's mental model of the text emerging. So as he gets to the end, this writer says he wanted people to have life. You really start to see their overall mental representation of this text, their overall sense of meaning. And you can really see that as they are writing, they're deriving meaning from the text and constructing a mental model. So they are actively in the process of reading comprehension. We talked about that active process of reading comprehension. That's where you can really see it in action is in their writing. So we have those four critical levers of reading comprehension: fluency, background knowledge, including vocabulary, that ability to make coherent inferences, and writing. Let's think about how Amplify ELA integrates these levers into the program to support reading comprehension, and also talk about how you can strengthen those levers while using the program. Let's start with background knowledge. As program designers or as instructors, we want to be thinking of these questions when we think about supporting students with background knowledge. So as we're putting together a unit or as you're preparing to teach a unit, you're really trying to think, what knowledge does the text assume the reader has? What knowledge does the text provide for the reader? Which words are really critical for text understanding? And how can we integrate those words or that vocabulary work into instruction? um, Literacy programs really start with their scope and sequence when they think about knowledge building. And Amplify really does pay a lot of attention to this idea of building coherent knowledge. So scope and sequence is the first place you want to consider in terms of knowledge demands and knowledge building. ELA's overall scope and sequence is designed to provide students exposure to a large range of topics and genres and text structures and vocabulary. So between grade 6 and grade 8, but continuing from the work they've been doing, if they've been working with CQLA from grades 1 through 5, they're really thinking a lot about informational text, literary text, plays, speeches, different text genres, also different time periods, different parts of the world. They're really building an overall kind of variety of knowledge areas. But even within particular units, the scope and sequence of each unit is designed to develop and support the knowledge students need to work with the unit. It takes that knowledge into account. So we think about what is an accessible starting point for this unit? How is the knowledge students are developing and carrying forward? What is the knowledge that we want students to develop and carry forward? And then how are students being asked to apply that knowledge as they move through the unit? So this is an example, again, going back to that grade 7 unit, Poe Poetry. The unit starts with having students work with one of Emily Dickinson's riddle poems. This work builds their familiarity with 19th century literature and language in a more accessible way. They're kind of focused on trying to figure out what is she describing, but they're playing around with just the visual imagery. So it allows them to practice using imagery to make meaning from the text. Then students move on to pose Telltale Heart, where they're going to, again, be using that initial work with imagery to kind of think through the visual imagery Poe is using. But we're also in those early lessons of with Poe's Telltale Heart, we're going to scaffold their fluency with strategic, excuse me, we're going to scaffold their fluency with strategic use of audio, animation, and repeated reads so that students get the voice of the text in their heads and they can support, and that really supports their fluency with this particular text. And at the end of the unit, when students have worked with two of the Poe's narrative stories and are familiar with his narrators, his vocabulary, his use of imagery, then students read The Raven. But now they can apply all this earlier practice with Poe, with imagery, with narrative voice to tackle this harder task of working with a poem. So, when you're thinking about the work that you're doing with Amplify ELA, I think you should be assured that the scope and sequence is designed to both expose students to a lot of different text types and topics to build their knowledge. And we're curating the units and sequencing the text within the units to support gradual knowledge building. But when you need more support for the background knowledge, when you like look at your students and you think of and you're kind of planning for this unit and you think, I actually need to beef up their background knowledge more, um, feel free to strengthen that kind of background knowledge by having the class work through the background and context documents as they start the units. And those are available in every unit overview in the materials section. So in terms of the background knowledge, think a lot about how the unit has been sequenced and put together, but also feel free to use that background and context document to kind of beef up that floor of accessibility in a way that you think makes sense for your students. Another critical area of knowledge for strong reading comprehension is word knowledge. So both the breadth and the depth of students' vocabulary. Again, we talked about the vocabulary demands of a writer like Poe. He's using a lot of words that students are not hearing in everyday language, not hearing in the conversations around them. Um, so again, the program really tries to provide word knowledge supports and development opportunities and integrate those opportunities into students' daily work. So on the left, what you're seeing is the reveal tool that is embedded in the digital e-reader. But for students using print, they also have a glossary. And what that does, it provides support for words that are critical for understanding the text. So you can see all those words, they see those critical words underlined or bolded. They can click on the word to find a short contextual definition. If you think back to that earlier fluency slide where, as we talked about a reader stumbling over particular words, this reveal tool means that readers can continue to put their cognitive energy into deriving meaning from the whole sentence or paragraph rather than getting blocked by a word that is critical to understanding. I will say when Amplify built this reveal tool, they experimented a lot with putting a full dictionary next to the students, and instead that the dictionary kind of led students down a rabbit hole of trying to figure out which was the correct definition that went in this particular place in this particular text. These very context-dependent short definitions seem to allow students to continue reading without getting caught up in that particular word and that particular definition. But then obviously we want students to continue to build their bank of words that they have mastered. So a subset of those words, those important text academic words, is then pulled into the vocabulary app. And that ensures that students are having daily practice with those high leverage academic words. And the work in the vocab app is designed both to help them master particular words like vehemently, but it also builds their word skills, that word knowledge. So the different games take them through things like how to work with context clues, providing them practice with considering words in relation to one another, or even morphology. But again, there are many opportunities that you might just have to strengthen this critical component of reading comprehension, to strengthen their word knowledge. So you might want to provide additional instruction in how words work. And I would invite you to really use the vocabulary modules that are aligned to each unit. So for example, in the PO unit, we've aligned a vocabulary module that has to do with figurative language, how words work figuratively. These provide targeted practice with particular areas of word knowledge, and then you some suggestions for how to apply that to the particular unit. We might also want to provide targeted practice with word skills relevant to the vocabulary words from a particular set of lessons. So again, also available in your unit overview materials, the words to know, words to use routine can work alongside students' individual vocabulary practice in the vocab app, but it allows you as a teacher to choose particular skills for particular words. So maybe you want to think about a skill like gesticulation and you want to say, this is a great one for morphology. You will find a little exercise within that words to know, words to use sheet where you could really look at the morphology of a particular word and have students break it down. All right, we talked earlier about how fluency has a strong correlation, a 0.5 correlation with reading comprehension, meaning I know a lot about your reading comprehension from your level of fluency. Students need to hear fluent readings. They need repeated at bats with fluency, and they need to focus on both accuracy and prosody. I will say this is largely has been a really neglected area in middle school reading. I think we've looked at this idea, well, once they have word recognition skills, they don't need to practice fluency. But you could probably hear even me trying to read Poe fluently, I need to practice. So there's huge benefits to continue to have kids hear and practice fluency. Um, and we do in Amplify try to front load fluency at the start of students' work with a new text. So you'll see at the start a much greater emphasis on having kids listen to fluent readings of the text. In those telltale heart lessons, for example, the first lesson is just they listen to the text. They then see an animated version of the text with the read aloud, and then they kind of practice visualizing and thinking about what they see as they read. Um, so students need these models of fluency. They need both models for accuracy and prosody. I will say there are some great AI tools being developed to read the text aloud, and they're getting much better at prosody, much less of that robot voice. Hearing the text also leverages students' listening comprehension, which remains ahead of their reading comprehension often till about ninth or 10th grade. But it also gets the voice of the text into their own heads. So when you release them to read independently or work independently with the text, even with a new section of that same text, they have a model for how that text sounds in their head. So there is fluency built into the program, but definitely please find ways to build an additional fluency practice. So in place of certain read alouds or as part of certain read alouds, build in a practice that focused on word recognition. Maybe you take a paragraph like this or a couple sentences like this, the whole class reads them together, and then you have students identify and practice tricky words. Maybe it's the reveal words. Maybe they have to practice all the multisyllabic words. Maybe it's domain specific. Maybe it's their choice about words that they don't recognize, and then have them practice in pairs. And when students stumble over a word, just develop the practice of pausing the reading to pronounce the word correctly and have the whole class repeat that pronunciation. Because if one student is stumbling, it's likely that many students are stumbling. And absolutely, this is much more fun. Find strong opportunities in the text that lend themselves to prosody practice. So identify sentences where the meaning of the sentence shifts depending on where a reader places emphasis in their reading. Is the narrator really upset that people think that he's mad, or is he really trying to kind of say how nervous he actually has been? Depending on where that emphasis lies, or depending on where students decide they want to place that emphasis, is a good indication of how they're understanding that text. Have students mark up the text, deciding which words they will stress, and then have them perform, and then have them discuss and defend the choices they made in their reading. Um, and of course, readers' theater is a great vehicle for prosody practice. And please take advantage of the fluency practice activity and routine that's found in every Amplify ELA Flex Day. So every 3 or 4 lessons, there's a lesson called a Flex Day. Within that, there are two activities that together make up a full fluency practice of prosody and word recognition and accuracy. So you'll find these in each Flex Day. It's the same partner routine. So once the kids learn it, they'll have it for the whole year. It allows them to practice word recognition and prosody. There are rubrics embedded so they can measure their progress. There's also a PDF attached to the Flex Day and the lesson materials that helps you take that fluency practice in the Flex Day and turn it into a 5-day practice. Fluency is one of the best tested and easiest ways to support stronger comprehension. So making it part of your teaching practice with Amplify ELA will have big payoffs. All right, we talked about background knowledge, we talked about fluency. Let's talk about this need for students to make a coherent mental model of the text, this idea of causal inferencing. Amplify close reading is really the key way in which students interact with the text. And as we design these close readings to support the type of meaning making and inference that builds comprehension, we're really thinking about how can we create a close reading that helps students, that really unpacks the process for students of understanding this text. How can we provide activities that surface the range of understandings that students have about the text? And how can we provide opportunities for students to refine their comprehension? So when you look at a close reading, and this is, or the instructions for one of a close readings, this is again from Poe Poetry. Um, you're really trying to support students in the process of comprehension, not just the product. So if I read this example on the right, um, if I'm just concerned with like what is the product of comprehension, I'm really asking students to read the text and then jumping right to what changes from the beginning to end of comprehension of the paragraph. If I'm interested in helping unpack what strong comprehenders do, I might give them a set of directions like first, how does the narrator feel at the start of the paragraph and which text details show the narrator's feelings? How does the narrator feel at the end of the paragraph and which text details show the narrator's feelings? Now compare those two and think about what changes from the beginning to the end. So rather than present that question about the final product, the instructions are really sequencing the process and types of connections a student needs to be making as they think about that change. So the close readings really walk students through the process of comprehension, not just the product. They're really trying to ask students to consider the meaning at the word, sentence, and text level because those are the levels at which students are trying to build these coherent models. And discussion tries to surface the range of understandings that students might have, asking students to explain the connections that they are making. You'll find a lot of opportunities and ways within close readings to support students to purposely unpack the text. So let's think about that really difficult passage from Telltale Heart we read earlier from that unit in grade 7. In this case, Amplify provides a storyboard. So it really is like you're trying to build a mental model, create a visual representation of that model. Um, and students have a lot of fun with this. And the collaborative nature of of our close readings provide lots of opportunities for kids to work together to strengthen and solidify the model that they're making, and really to kind of refine their comprehension. All right, I'm going to try to go to a video. Let's see if I'm successful. Because I really would love you to watch two students working on the storyboard app collaboratively and really think about how many times students kind of look back at the text or prompt each other to look back at think about their understanding of the text or explain why they want to represent the text in a particular way.
Yeah. He's asking like why aren't they going to the police in the background?
Yeah,
They're
so
searching.
they're still there. He was like, what are they doing? So you want to go to them sitting there? With like, because he was like, they are?
Because he's asking like why aren't they gone?
I thought he was saying like, here. Oh, because I highlighted this part. It was like, and still the man chattered pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Like he was like, have they heard it? Or like, why aren't they leaving? He was getting nervous that they would find out. So you would still want to put the part where they were there, or you just want to do him thinking like, why aren't they leaving?
Because so they arose and argued about trifles and a high key with a violent gesticulation. But the noise steadily increased. Why would not they not be gone? So they probably heard something. So I was thinking you could do like the curious face where they're looking at each other.
Yeah, we can put a couple of them looking like, what is he talking about?
I'm gonna do that one because he looks like.
And then he's got some dialogue here that's directly from our section. Why did you pick that he was laying down?
Because when it says he started to tear up the floorboard, that's kind of what it looks like.
Awesome.
And then
So,
the heart is underneath it.
okay, so make sure that you guys are sharing because I really like that thought process. And I like the thought process of some things that he has that you don't have. So if you put those together, that's going to be very, very clear. Nice.
So just like in that earlier writing example that we looked at from Frankenstein, you can really see in those conversations students developing and refining the coherence of their mental model. And you can see like because the activity, in this case, the storyboard app, is kind of structured to kind of have students actively going through that process of reading comprehension, you can see that the teacher can kind of intervene at that moment and nudge the students very easily to kind of think through the types of inferencing they're making. And you'll find built-in opportunities for this type of collaborative refining of comprehension throughout the program. So most obviously, we have an activity type that's called text as referee, and that's where students are working in pairs to try to convince a partner that their interpretation of the text is stronger. So here they follow a very specific routine and protocol where they each share their answer or their response to a question about the text, and then they kind of explain and elaborate their interpretation, why they think their interpretation is correct, why they think it's a strong causal inference. And then they kind of have to compare and make connections to another person's interpretation. And then they rethink their interpretation of light in light of what was discussed with the partner. So all this supports meaning making and also kind of gets them to think through again these skills of causal inferencing. You'll also find many opportunities in the instructional guide for each activity to have students debrief their answers, to share their answers, and compare their understanding of the text. But keep in mind a few basic questions to use in these moments to reinforce and remind students to make these types of causal inferences. So really simple questions. I'm sure you guys are very well versed in them. What in the text made you think that? Have kids go back and try and take what's in the text, describe it with their own words, and then reason using that information. Or have them go back to the text, highlight the reasons you think X. Highlight what in the text makes you think X. Those are ways that, you're really trying to, again, use close reading to work with students in that active process of comprehension. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, take advantage of all the ways in which writing is embedded within the program to support reading comprehension. The writing prompts are embedded 2 or 3 times weekly, those 10 to 12-minute writes, at the end of a close reading. Yes, they're designed to practice writing skills, but they're also designed to support students to develop and express their comprehension. So this example shows how a student writer methodically thinks through a particular understanding of the text, Roald Dahl's boy, connecting pieces of the text to develop a coherent understanding. So the prompt is, Dahl says earlier in the chapter that Mrs. Pratchett was a horror. This is from a grade 6 unit. Do you agree or disagree? Describe 2 or 3 details from the text to develop your claim about Mrs. Pratchett. Yes, I agree that Mrs. Pratchett is a horror. I think she is the meanest person I've ever heard of. In the text it says, I'm watching you, so keep your thieving finger off them chocolates. That also supports that she's a horror because she doesn't trust anyone, and she thinks that people would want to eat her infected chocolate. The second thing that the text says, I don't want you to be in here just to look around. Either you folks out or you gets out. This also shows that she's a horror because she only has a candy shop for money. This shows she likes taking money from little children. The last thing from the text says, it was her hands, however, that disturbed me the most. They were disgusting. They were black with dirt and grime. They looked as though they'd been putting lumps of coal on the fire all day. That also makes her a horror because she loves being mean to children so much she doesn't have time to wash up. That's why I think she's a horror. So again, as a teacher looking at this writing, I'm very excited to see that overall this writer is making very reasonable and coherent use of the text to arrive at an understanding of character. So she's taking certain pieces of evidence and she's making clear inferences based on that text. There's only one small piece at the end where she jumps to an unreasonable inference, that idea that Mrs. Pratchett doesn't have time to wash up. There's nothing in the text that would make one think that. But again, reviewing that writing becomes an important way, like doing the writing is an important way for students to construct their comprehension. Reviewing the writing can become a really strong window for teachers into a student's ability to make coherent inferences. You can also see when comprehension breaks down in the writing. So let's look at this example, the same prompt about Mrs. Pratchett in Dahl. Let's see what this writer said. I agree, because 1, I have had this happen to me before. 2, because she sounds like a person that I would talk trash to and get mad at and call her names. 3, because she has a filthy body. I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't have a shower or she never showers. Lastly, because she reminds me of a character from a TV show I used to watch. I always got mad at her when she did something bad to the students. So here, you can see the student is making a lot of non-causal inferences. I've had this happen to me. She sounds like a person I know. She reminds me of this other character. They're using a lot of other sources of information outside the text and kind of directly translating that as their understanding of how this text is working. So a teacher looking at this can kind of start to really think that this student's problems with inferencing might be a source of why this student is struggling with comprehension. So maybe as a teacher then, you target the student for more over-the-shoulder conferences while they're reading to ask some of that causal questioning. Or you have them work collaboratively with a stronger comprehender in situations to refine their understanding. But I would also take advantage of the writing revision assignments in all Amplify Flex days to ask the student to think again about what they have written. This revision assignment provides a specific routine for the student writer to find additional details in the text, not from outside the text. So here's a place where you use details from the text as evidence to develop your idea. Reread the text and identify 2 or more text details that connect to your idea. Write 3 to 5 more sentences using and describing those details, so prompting the student to not just put those details down, but kind of describe their understanding of those details to explain your idea. So in this instance, I've used writing as a means to measure my students' comprehension and writing or revision as a means to support stronger comprehension. Writing about a text is really the student's comprehension constructed on the page, just like this quote says. Extracting meaning is to understand what an author has stated explicitly or implicitly. Constructing meaning, what we all have to do to get to strong comprehension, is to interpret what an author has said by bringing one's capacities, abilities, knowledge, and experiences to bear on what he or she is reading. But to do so in kind of a reasonable and coherent way. I'm going to end by going back to that definition of reading comprehension, this active process where students are really deriving meaning from printed language and constructing a mental model that's based, yes, on what's read, but that what is read has to also pull on their knowledge of the world and words. To strengthen reading comprehension with your Amplify ELA program, really try and pay attention to leveraging and enhancing the fluency practice, focusing on word knowledge in addition to the vocabulary app practice students are getting. Use those collaborative close reads that happen in those daily lessons to really think about how is this close reading unfolding the process of reading comprehension. And then obviously to integrate writing as not only a kind of way to push their writing skills, but as a way for you to measure and develop their comprehension skills. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. That was so great. Unfortunately, we're a little bit over time, so I don't think we're going to be able to go over the questions. I just want to remind everyone that we do have more webinars in this series, including one in just a couple of days. So feel free to register for those at amplify.com/fall 2025-SOR-demos. And I just threw that in the chat. We really appreciate you fighting through your cold, Deb. I want to give you time to go rest and recover. And I also want to thank all of you here today with us for joining and staying engaged. And just a quick little plug, we have our Amplify ELA Educator panel next Thursday, December 11th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern and 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific. So if you want to learn more about Amplify ELA and how real everyday educators use it with their students, that would be a great webinar to attend. So thank you all so much. And Deb, please feel better.
Thank you.
Take care.